introduce the panelists to everybody, I'd just very quickly like to give to set some context about what this panel is going to be about. So millions of people across the world live with a range of physical and mental disabilities. But what exactly is disability? How does one define it? According to the World Health Organization, in recent years, the understanding of disability has moved away from a physical or a medical perspective to one that takes a person's physical, social, and political context into account. So, although people with disabilities sometimes refers to a single large population, it's actually a very diverse group of people with a wide range of needs. Two people, even with the same type of disability, can be affected in very different ways because of their gender, their class, age, caste, etc. So when you have over 15% of the world's population, and that's 1 billion people, identifying as living with a disability of some sort, it's of course, it becomes obvious that they have to tell their stories and that their stories have to be heard by the rest of the world. And that brings us to the question, how can we write about disability without homogenizing experiences? How can writing help people understand the intersections between disability and other identities such as gender, sexuality, age, and some of the others that I mentioned before? And crucially, how might we better represent the lived experience of people with disabilities across different types of literature? So this is, some of the questions that we will be addressing in the panel today. And I will just now quickly introduce our three amazing panelists. I'll start with Renu. So Renu Addlakha is currently a professor at the Center for Women's Development Studies, an Indian Council of Social Science Research supported autonomous research institute. She is presently engaged in research on health, disability, gender, and development. Renu did her master's in social work from Delhi University, followed by an MPhil in sociology from the same university. And she also has a doctorate in sociology from the Delhi School of Economics. She's been working on health and disability issues for the past 2 decades and has been published widely in national and international peer-reviewed journals. She's currently a project director for a Women's Fund Asia sponsored study titled Violence Against Women and Girls with Physical Disabilities in India, Understanding the Issues and Promoting Legal Empowerment, and a Ford Foundation sponsored study on the intersections of disability and sexuality in India. Shreya Anasuya is a writer of fiction, non-fiction, and poetry. Shreya is also the managing editor of Skin Stories, a digital publication on sexuality, disability, and gender housed at the non-profit organization Point of View. Skin Stories features first-person narratives, reportage, and commentary on disability and amplifies the voices of people with disabilities and chronic illness. It has won awards, been featured in festivals and conferences, and is used as a resource by organizations, widely republished in the media, and is taught in several university classrooms across the world. Recently, an anthology of Skin Stories edited by Shreya was launched as a physical book. And this is very close to me because some of my writing is in that book as well. Shruti Rao is an author and editor based in the SF Bay Area, California. She has a master's degree in energy engineering and worked in the IT industry before she started writing. She has written 9 books for children, both fiction and nonfiction. Her latest is 10 Women Who Were the First to Do What They Did. Her book, Manya Learns to Roar, about a girl who stammers and wants to be on the school play, won the Children First contest organized by Duckbill Books and Parag Trust. So these are our fabulous panelists for the day. I'm going to be posing a few questions to the panelists individually, and after that I will ask some questions that will be open for anyone to answer. So my first question is to Renu. So your writing, Renu, is more from an academic, bird's eye view of disability studies as a discourse. And you've especially explored the role that institutions like the government and healthcare systems play in the lived experience of people with disability. One of the most interesting things I thought you covered in your book, which is called Disability Studies in India, Global Discourses, Local Realities, was the shifting focus from disability as a medical condition only needing clinical intervention to something that needs social and academic legitimacy. So could you speak to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, as you pointed out, the WHO has expanded the idea of disability at the law of international law to move it beyond the clinic, beyond the hospital, beyond a physical or a mental deviation from the norm. You will notice I do not want to use words like normality and abnormality because these are contingent categories. They vary historically, they vary culturally, they vary among different groups, and hence at a given point of time, there's a certain, shall we say, over dominating perspective or discourse, which then becomes recognized as normal and hence naturalized, that there is nothing beyond this. So, for example, if you take the idea of blindness, now, what does blindness mean? It means let's take total blindness for clarity's sake. It means someone who cannot see. Now, in the population and in the biosphere, sight, it is an important category of existence. But blindness means you don't have sight. So because that is a critical category of existence and the majority of people are having that capacity, you are labeled different. But that's it. The fact that you suffer pity, the fact that you suffer exclusion, the fact that you have lack of access to important, say, institutions, schools, or a job, or the marriage market, or relationships, is nothing to do with the fact of the absence of sight. It is the social construct of the individual who is supposed to be a particular kind of person who would then have access to all this. And hence, society does not cater to the needs of this person who can't see. So in that way, I just want to clarify, we need to examine each kind of deviation, biological or social, from the perspective of how it relates with the dominant discursive formation at a given point of time and space. And hence, when you talk about disability, it's not just lack, need, incapacity, abnormality. I think we need to factor in the disability experience creativity. Because I can't see, I'm going to take initiative for survival. I'm going to take creative charge of my life to manage this life in the absence of a capacity. It needs to take, disability needs to factor in the idea of hence creativity, capacity, innovation, and initiative. So I think when we look at this way that I don't want to take too much time, but basically that we need to flip the category of disability from the way that we have been socialized to examine it and give ourselves reflective capacity to look at this and then look at people with disabilities and disability through these almost contradictory lenses to the dominant discourse.
Thank you, Renu. I think that is so profound, and it's such a wonderful way of looking at it, because it very neatly actually goes into the question that I had for Shreya, which was that the general response to disability oscillates between pity and inspiration. And I think, Renu, you captured so beautifully how there are so many things that are considered that people with disabilities do not have access to, not because of their disability itself, but because of the perception that other people have and the lens through which people insist on seeing people with disabilities. So thank you so much. Shreya, so given this whole pity inspiration sort of binary or the spectrum, you have edited Skin Stories, which is a collection of lived experiences of people with disabilities. What would you say is the role of disability life narratives in literature? And I'm going to ask you an even more existential question, which is, what really is literature? And why is it important for people to write about their own lives and their own experiences?
Thank you so much, and thank you for that wonderful beginning, Renu. You know what Renu was saying about dominant narratives, about the dominant discourse, positioning disability as a lack or a lack of capacity, rather than the fault lying in society to not provide access to various different types of bodies and minds. Not keeping in mind neurodiversity or physical diversity, and only really catering to a very, very sort of an assumed neutral user of services, or an assumed neutral citizen, which is actually the most normative, the most status quoist imagination of society possible. So literature actually reflects that. The mainstream in literature reflects the mainstream in socio-political realities. So, which is why it becomes incredibly important to look at things like the own voices movement in literature. The idea that people with diverse experiences have the right to tell their own stories, rather than subjecting these stories to the really, really limiting lenses of pity and inspiration, or whatever else that kind of really not only do a disservice, but are completely inaccurate representations of lived realities. Which is why I feel that life narratives, particularly from marginalized positions, become incredibly important, because they give us information and they give us depth and substance in a way that external lenses cannot. What are the lenses of pity and inspiration after all? They're external lenses. They're not coming from an experience that the person that is employing them has. They're not saying, they're not, when I, as a person with psychosocial disability or someone with a chronic illness, I'm talking about my experience. I'm not talking about myself as someone to be pitied or someone to look up to just because I exist, right? I'm necessarily going to talk about the things that are real to me. And that automatically includes the ways in which many, many things become inaccessible, such as a lot of writers for Skin Stories have talked about, for example, structural issues like just physical infrastructure not being accessible to people with physical disabilities. Our writer Sonali Gupta talks about how just even going out in the city of Mumbai becomes so difficult because she is a wheelchair user, and places that could easily have a ramp don't have it. And that's not Sonali's problem. It's the problem of the larger design of the city, that it's not accessible. So when Sonali is telling you that story, she's not talking about how amazing she is just for wanting to go out, because she's saying, hey, I need to go out. It's very basic, and automatically it gives you a much fuller, full-bodied, complex and nuanced and accurate representation of a lived experience of disability. Similarly, a couple of our writers have spoken about how caste has posed, caste-based discrimination has posed to be such a huge barrier to accessing mental health care services that are sensitive. Rachel Bharti Chandran and Christina Thomas Dhanraj have both written really excellent stories about how access, and their stories are very different from each other. And I encourage our viewers to go find them online on Skin Stories. incredibly different, but both of them are talking from the perspective of how caste-based discrimination is intimately linked with this, inaccessible sort of, experience of mental health care. So immediately when you have people's own voices telling their own stories, you get what the opposite of the danger of a single story, which Chimananda Adichie has warned against. Which is why I feel like good storytelling from people who have these lived experiences is incredibly important, and amplifying these voices, reading them, seeking them out is incredibly important.
Yeah, completely agree. I think even one of the things that we discussed, Shreya, was about how the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2016 expanded its list of what it considered disabilities from 7 to 21. And it didn't mean that the people who were living with those 14 remaining conditions were not experiencing a life of disability before that act came along. So, there's always that difference, like you said, the legal catching up with the lived experiences. And that's why it's so important to I feel, tell those like stories of how we live our lives. And that's the only way people will really know about it. We have to kind of break through the normative storytelling in society. Thank you. The next question is to Shruti. So Shruti, you write mostly for children, and your protagonists in two books especially that I would like to focus on for this panel. One is called Susie Will Not Speak, and the other one is Manya Learns to Roar. They're both about young girls who have speech impediments of some sort. Could you tell us a little bit about why you chose that common theme, and also why are children your primary audience? What also, if you would like to mention, what is your opinion about non-disabled authors writing about characters who have disability?
I stammer. So as a child who grew up with a stammer, it was very hard for me in the sense I was bullied, I was taunted, people thought I was stupid, I was not confident, I was nervous, and I was shy. But the reality was not that at all. I was none of those things. But the problem is that mainstream media, like TV and movies and books and everything, they all portrayed people who stammer in a negative light. So first of all, it was for comic relief. Secondly, it was either they were kind of disturbed, or they had a dark past, or they had evil intentions, or they were nervous or confident, same old stuff. So
yeah, and you gave me the example of Professor Quirrell from Harry Potter, and I had never even made the connection before.
Absolutely. I mean, if an author like Rowling puts in a character who purposely puts on a stammer to kind of show himself as weak and insecure and as a person of no consequence. I mean, think of a child who is reading that. What kind of an effect will that child have, right? I mean, it's like heartbreaking. My heart goes out to kids. So when I saw all that, I said, where are the people like me? The people like me who are not shy, who are not nervous, who are not anxious, who have no stage fear, don't mind going on the stage and speaking. Where are those people like me? So that is why when Parag Trust and Duckbill Books called for they had a contest about asking for stories that speak about children facing challenges, but at heart we are all children. So for that I wrote a story, Manya Learns to Roar, in which I took a girl who has a stammer and I kind of made her want to go on stage. So that is absolutely the opposite of what people expect. People expect the opposite. The child is afraid to go on stage. So I wanted to kind of break the stereotype, because that is what I mean. I'm pretty sure many people who stammer are like that. So and so. And also Susie will not speak is also a part of that. I mean, once again, I found that people who lisp also have a very similar kind of a life experience as people who stammer, because of the kind of taunting and the stereotypes that they face. So uh, that's why that's why I wrote Susie. As for your question about why my primary audience is children, um, see, I cannot speak for other adults, but speaking for myself, I know that now as an adult, I kind of know my uh, place in society. I have come to terms with my stammer, and now I know that I am not my stammer. My stammer is only part of me, but when I was a child, it wasn't like that. It was this huge thing, which kind of took my entire life. But no, I was struggling with it. Nobody else spoke like me, and I was like, "Why? What is wrong with me?" And I was alone. And I look at movies and TVs and TV, and people are laughing at people who stammer. So I want children to know that I wanted children to have positive representations also of people who stammer, and also not only for the children who stammer. Other children need to look at uh, as, children with stammers as someone like them, not someone to be laughed at or to pity, to know someone like them. So that is why I write about, so that is why I think children need such stories more than adults do. While I'm not saying adults do not need such stories, but because of my experience, I kind of feel that children need this much more. And your other question was, about uh, non-disabled authors writing about disabled children, disabled stories. So that is a kind of a tricky question, because if I say they should not write about it, it would become a slippery slope, and it would be like, write what you know, right? So I don't agree with that. So what I would say is, rather than ask that question, I would kind of turn it around and say we need more people, people like Shreya was talking about own voices. We need more of us to come out and speak of our experiences, because that's where all the nuance and the authenticity comes in, because we know, right? I mean, we know what it is to kind of live that life. So um, kind of it makes it all the more rich. But on the other hand, if a non-disabled person wants to write about it, they should, but they should not claim to know what that person is thinking, and they shouldn't speak for that person, if that makes sense. By all means, include the characters, but do not kind of put words into that character's mouth. That's what
I think that's a really good way of looking at it, because we say that representation is important, role models are important, but we also have to acknowledge that a lot of the people creating content out there are not disabled.
Yes. Exactly.
Like we mentioned before, it's an intersectional thing. It's not just your disability. Caste plays a role, your gender plays a role, your sexuality plays a role. So you're rarely going to find somebody who ticks all of those boxes.
Yes.
But yeah, it's I think very important to be empathetic and to maybe speak to. I think it's important, if a person is writing about a character with a disability, they should
You
speak to
speak to
somebody or
people.
get it
Yeah.
vetted by somebody who, has gone through that experience. Another thing, just to add here is how I know I have experienced this, is that whenever people come across a story of, so I'm an amputee, whenever people come across a story of an amputee doing something, climbing a mountain or whatever, I will have that same link sent to me by like 10 different people. But usually those stories are written by able-bodied people about a person with a disability, and it's written through that lens of inspiration. Again, despite not having a leg, this person has climbed Mount Everest. Let's clap for her. And I find it really annoying because I don't think I'm the audience for that story at all. The audience is the able-bodied reader who wants to find inspiration in this, and it's so much easier to say that if she could do this, why can't you, or what's your excuse, or narratives like that, to you know just to add to how it's not just important for people with disabilities to see representations of themselves. It's equally important for able-bodied people to see that there are other kinds of people out there who
Yes.
um, you know exist and lead normal and complex lives. Um, Thank you, Shruti. Now I have a question that I will open to whoever wants to answer. Um, so we've been talking all this while about how disability is just one piece of this intersectional puzzle, and it's closely related to many other aspects of a lived experience. In an increasingly polarized society, which is reading fewer books and wants to consume quicker, snappier content, how can we do two things? One is still continue having these important conversations and building empathy. And secondly, how can we expand the scope of literature to be more accessible, to people who are not reading books? Renu, would you like to answer this?
Yeah. See, I'll come back to my earlier idea of the moment that we are living in an age of an idea of great autonomy, great choice, great liberation, great kind of options available. And yes, it is true, even in my own generation, I can see the difference over the last, 40 years. But I think we need to remember that we are every moment has its characteristics, and individuals, they may think they are making, very personal, individual, very revolutionary choices. But at the moment, at any given moment, whether it is the Stone Age or whether it is the Tech Age, we are circumscribed, and we operate within a certain set of material, social, cultural, and political and economic circumstances. So this moment is no different. There is this explosion of technology. I mean, you don't see people anymore reading books. I mean, our generation, we had summer vacations, and what did? You got bored and you read a book. I don't see books in people's hands anymore, and the printing industry is complaining and everything's going online. But it doesn't mean people are not reading. People are reading what's available. The writing is snappier. Everything is much more concise, encapsulated, and quick, because the tempo of time is faster. That's the way technology is moving. So in that sense, do we want people to return to an older mode of a more laid back, introspective kind of consumption pattern, to reflect, to discuss over cups of tea as lotus eaters? Or do we want to, or can we do that actually? I think the thing is to make it snappier, and to come back to your description, how you feel annoyed that an amputee story is linked to you and they say, oh, you're so great, you can also do it. Look, amputees are doing everything. I think, even when a non-disabled writer writes in a stigmatizing way about disability, oh, these people, they're less, whatever. I think in an era of open consumption and the capacity that technology gives to resources, those views need to be there. I don't want... I'm not in favor of the politically correct discourse to dominate the space. I think people should see the worst and the best, and then you give them a choice. And I have faith that if people are driven by interests, if their interests will benefit, if their interests seem to be move towards the direction that we need to accept diversity, we need to invest in individuality, it will happen. And last but not least, I think so many of today's younger generation and even older generation are themselves disabled. They don't think they're disabled because they're not falling into the stereotypical categories, but the level of psychological distress and the level of physical, shall we say, deviation due to a sedentary lifestyle, due to a whole range of dietary factors. So I think people need to be encouraged to identify with the category of disability more. How am I disabled? The question should not be, is Renu disabled, or is Shreya disabled, or is Shruti disabled? The question is, where do I fit in there? It's like when you look at Marilyn Monroe and you say, oh, I have lips like her. I'm like Marilyn Monroe. So I think we need to, coming back to my thing, that we need to exercise the creative impulse within us on disability and bring it as a closer category to our lives. It's for non-disabled people, I'm saying that. Skin stories, the own voice movement will continue. But I think somewhere we need to make people how we engage, and I think literature and media is an important tool. How am I disabled? Oh, if I have gluten intolerance, so I can't eat this and that, I have to be more careful. Well, someone with a wheelchair has to be more careful because they can't use the loo, which is not easily accessible. So you know what I mean? I think we need to, through literature, create these parallels, these possibilities, and open up these spaces for both discussion and introspection.
Yeah, that's a good thought, I think. Shreya, would you like to add?
I absolutely agree. And in fact, disability as a category is, just editing skin stories. I found just the diversity of experience, different ways in which people, exactly what Renu is saying, right? Like the different ways in which people have to contend with the ways in which they're different from the norm, right? And the ways in which accommodations are not necessarily made for them. So we do actually have stories about food intolerance and body diversity. Our program director, our former program director of the Sexuality and Disability program at Point of View, Nidhi Goyal, she has an essay about how people assume that her blindness is the most difficult experience that she has to live with, but actually it's her chronic illness because of digestive issues. And Antara, your own story, your counter to the travel narrative of the inspirational disabled woman traveler. Your story that says, I'm a woman traveler with a disability and my hashtag travel goals don't exist to inspire you. That's your story. And, that was such a powerful sort of counter narrative. And, both of those narratives exist side by side. As Renu pointed out, it's important that we see them side by side. And as readers, we make the choice to, to sort of choose, which narrative we sort of, I feel like automatically the more complicated narrative is also more enjoyable to read. Even as an editor, as a reader, I feel like a fuller story is always the better story, right? Yeah. I feel like in terms of format, I can speak to a couple of things that Skin Stories has, just experience of editing Skin Stories and bringing it out into the world. One is, Skin Stories was always online and in English. So in some ways, that's really expansive. Like it can reach someone it could not have reached a few generations ago because the internet exists, and someone sitting on the other side of the world can read it. On the other hand, in a country where a lot of people don't get to go online because that's another kind of access barrier, or many people who don't access content in English, that's actually an issue. So one of the big dreams for Skin Stories has always been to have translations. We have been translated, but in a limited way. I would like for Skin Stories to be available in more Indian languages, at least to start with. But just being online, and then also publishing the book offline to reach people who are not accessing us online. But also we started doing a series since the pandemic began. We started doing a series of online salons. We've had one so far where we have conversation about disability. We expand the scope of the various ways in which the Skin Stories can now manifest themselves and reach different audiences. And I feel like that's really important, because someone may not want to read a story, but they may want to come to a Zoom webinar. But through all this, it's really important for us to understand all the ways in which access is constrained. Like who has access to the internet, who is reading in English. And I feel like these are really important big questions for us. And the second thing I wanted to talk about was just storytelling, from a storytelling perspective, not to limit the kind of story you can tell. Sometimes people don't want to or are not able to write their own story, in which case it becomes really important for us to keep that in mind and send someone to cover it who is sensitive and will cover it well, And, so like Shruti, I don't think that there's any such, it's a slippery slope to say, hey, if you're not disabled, you can't ever write about disability. Rather, I mean, that also puts the onus only on a certain community to tell sensitive stories, and that's not okay either. And I find that what really helps is just having more stories commissioned and having a framework that encourages complex and deeper storytelling and encourages moving away from stigmatizing language, stigmatizing lenses, and to talk about stories and to amplify stories that are already being told. The community has always told stories. It's just a question of whether you're paying attention or not. If you're deliberately not reading them, or if, say, a mainstream platform is not amplifying those stories, then they're not reaching mainstream audiences. So, in terms of just the form and content, there are many different ways in which we can take intersectionality into account. We can take, technological shifts into account and look at the ways in which these stories can be made more widely available. And that for Skin Stories has been the main challenge, actually, because it's seen as a very niche publication. It's very small. It's published out of a non-profit. So, how do you reach people that are not the usual suspects? How do you reach people who may not have read it? And I find that when the stories do reach a variety of audiences, the reaction is, very often when we have feedback, it's like there's more points of commonality than people anticipated. And that's where some empathy building can start to happen. Someone reading a story about dating or romance, or workplace discrimination, or just a relationship with the self, body image, self-esteem, navigating larger social structures. There are many things that unite us across social location. And good storytelling, effective storytelling, can show us the ways in which we have more things in common than not.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think one of my essays in Skin Stories was about my experience with a dating app. And the number of people who wrote into me after that essay got published, and who didn't have disabilities, but who just felt like, oh, I have this particular other issue, and I always felt self-conscious about going on a dating app. And, reading this kind of made me feel like I could, maybe do it. It wouldn't be such a big deal. Totally. Like, they don't have to have disabilities to relate with your experience. Yeah. Thanks, Shreya. I'm just going to ask, sorry, Shruti, do you want to add anything to this question?
No, nothing. Thank you.
I'm going to ask one last question again to all panelists before we move on to the Q&A with the audience. Um, so, like we've discussed, this general response, the oscillation between pity and inspiration that we see in literature, in different forms of literature, in movies, in newspapers, in books, and things like that. How can we, as a writer community or an editor community, do better to represent the lived experience of people with disability across different types of literature? So what can newspapers do? What can writers do? What can publishers do? What can movies do? What is your opinion on that? Shruti, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I think one of the major things that we have to do is, like Shreya was talking about, actually a kind of commission more stories and bring the stories in to the mainstream. So right now it is kind of a niche, a topic of discussion. So we need to kind of speak more about it. And one more thing is to kind of bring the stories and characters into store a kind of books and movies without making them the focus of the story, not kind of dwelling on the disability. Make it a part of a story. I mean, try to portray how that person lives life, kind of navigates life without a kind of, talking about pity and inspiration. Kind of make it matter of fact. While I'm not saying this is not kind of trivializing it, but making it more matter of fact. Not talking about it as something great or something, oh no, so sad or something. Make it matter of fact. So that, I feel, that will go a long way in making the stories of disabled people part of the mainstream.
Yeah, completely agree. Renu, anything?
Yeah, I want to just continue the train of thought initiated by Shruti, which is that I think and Shruti would agree with me this, I think a very important group of people who are still open to ideas and who have really potential for bringing about change in the long run is students. And I think disability should become more part of, I don't know, lesson planning, maybe. And with the writer, don't make it inspirational or pitiful. Give students projects, maybe give them extra points and let them go out into the world to think about this, talk about this. I think we need, I would say to some extent, at least in the more better off universities in the country, disability is now in the social sciences coming to a space. It is being taken up by other people, but even faculty member, they're my generation, and there's this, oh, you want to work on disability, the test student. I don't know anything about disability. I am sick and tired of this expression, which many highly educated people say, oh, but I can't do that. I don't know anything about disability. What is disability? You should find somebody who's, who knows, maybe who's disabled, maybe you get specialized knowledge because you're disabled. But, I don't know. I may not be able to guide you. What the bloody hell? I mean, you can work on any other topic. Why the hell can't you work on disability? So I really feel that some of the fault lies with our teachers and our mentors at the school and university level. And I think they can play a really fundamental role. The thing is that they need to be motivated, pushed, and perhaps given an incentive to make this possible. So that's my take. Get the students, get the young people, but you can't get them like that. You've got to orient, you've got to hammer into the heads of their mentors and teachers what something like skin stories means, you know? And they have to be made interested, which they are not.
Yeah, I think that this is like really ringing true with me, and I think it's such an important aspect. The othering is so extreme when it comes to disability that it's like, you throw your hands up and say, I don't know anything about this. I've never lived with a disability. I don't know anybody who's lived with a disability. And this is when you're lucky enough for people to say the word disability. Otherwise, you have your divyang and you're specially abled, and all these very people are so scared of saying the word disability. It's I think there definitely needs to be much larger integration of that idea. Shreya, any remarks from you?
I think, Shruti and Renu have covered a massive amount of ground. The only thing I would want to add is, as editors, it's really easy to make some very small but important changes to create resources that can then, do so much out in the world. Like, not just commissioning, but just having a style guide, even like what language are we using when we talk about disability? When I read about disability in the mainstream media, when I read articles, I find that a lot of insensitive and very outdated language is still used. And there's no accountability, there's no checks and balances. People just continue to use this extremely dehumanizing language, and I think that really makes a difference, because that influences the way we talk about something in our day-to-day. So having a style guide, and there's a lot of really important and amazing work disability rights and this disability justice movement has done, scholars have done, activists have done, and people with disabilities have done to make language more expansive, make language more sensitive and more accurate ultimately. So, to have that style guide, to very deliberately say we're not going to, talk about disability in these dehumanizing ways, that's really important. And I feel like also a visual guide, I find that any news items, for example, that are related to something that editors consider quote unquote grim or serious, including sexual violence, the disembodied hand coming out of the ether and some cowering figure and that sort of thing, I also think that contributes to a certain kind of larger discourse that normalizes talking about these issues in a very, very unidimensional way. So at Skin Stories, we have a very deliberate, completely opposite perspective on how we want to illustrate. So our illustrations are, full of life. It's something you might want to scroll past and pause when you see on Instagram, something colorful, something, not telling that grim story, something that's a bit fuller. So a visual guide, and also, simple things like accessibility. So adding alt text so that people with visual impairment can actually access your pictures. You're describing, you're not over describing, but you're just adding some kind of guide on what that image is showing so that it's possible for someone using a screen reader to sort of also know what's in that image. It's not just coming up as a blank. So just basic things that editors can do, which wouldn't really, I don't think they would take a shift in resources or expansion of resources. They would just take some intention. They would just take some informed intention. And to really, go out there and seek out good information on how to create a wider bank of stories about disability, how to commission them, who to commission, who are your sources, who do you keep going back to, who is writing the stories, how are they writing them. These are things that we can be really intentional about in the mainstream media. And I feel like these would make a really big difference to the way that public discourse is shaped for generations to come.
Thank you, Shreya, and thank you, all of you. I think this has been a really wonderful and really full discussion. I was actually very concerned when I found out about the panelists, because you're all so accomplished in your own rights, but all of you write so differently, or have such different publications from each other. But I think that's actually contributed to a very rich set of perspectives today. We'll take some questions. So I'm going to combine two questions that we have here from Vijay Lakshmi and Sachi. So Vijay Lakshmi's question is, much of pop culture and literature these days is ableist, even when it is otherwise progressive, and even woke people give such stories a pass. What can we do to challenge this apathy? And Sachi says, what do you think about the impact of mainstream movies like Tare Zameen Par? Additionally, what do you think about stories like that which want to ascribe some other miraculous talent to characters with disability, almost as if to make up for their disability? How do we deal with such expectations in our storytelling? I think both of these questions are quite connected to each other. So I'll let, does anybody want to answer?
Yeah, about Tare Zameen Par, that's a very valid question. It is always like that. Like, you have to make up for it with some other dazzling talent, which is not so in real life, because in real life we're all mostly ordinary people going along with our ordinary lives. So that also comes into the picture, that to compensate you ought to have something else, otherwise you're not there, you're not useful. So that's not a very good way to go. I don't really have any other
that's
thing to say. Yeah.
Renu, Shreya, is there anything you'd like to add to this question?
I just like to say that, what happens, and I'm giving this from my experience of observing non-disabled people, and I'm giving my own example because, well, it's own stories, so why not give our own stories? See, I have this visual problem, and I've been, at various levels throughout life, as a person with this visual problem, as an only child, I have experienced a lot of putting down, both within the family and outside. And there have been many negative experiences in life, including dropping out of school, etc. But once I got into the pathway that I am, because I wasn't a child prodigy, it took me a long time to actually get myself academically, moving from grade D to grade A. So it was a long and painful childhood journey, and the scars are still there. But as soon as I became accomplished, let's put it that way, I began getting good grades in school. I topped the social sciences, and, I had a word with language. I was articulate. Somehow, the fact that there was a conscious attempt by people at that point to normalize me. Oh, you're not disabled. She's not disabled. It was almost like they had to not accept that she's both disabled and can be brilliant. No, she is brilliant, and disability, she copes so well, she's so meticulous, she doesn't allow that to come in her way, she doesn't use that to get benefits, so it's there, but it's not so important, look at her. So that's another way, there's this almost desperate hanging on to these other socially acceptable attributes, and then say, wo problem to hai, shadi mein, there'll be a problem in marriage. You can see she has a problem. But look at this, it's unbelievable. How does she do it? So how do we handle this? Frankly, I don't have a solution because I've just lived with it and, moved along with the tide. Maybe it's not something that is, amenable to the techno social solutions that a given generation has. Maybe even if you were to ask Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, he'd tell you something similar. They just didn't want to see my disability. They just wanted to see my physics.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to representation, all of these ideas do come to the forefront again, because again, we have a lot of people who are writing and directing and acting in these movies are not people who have experienced that kind of the disabled reality or whatever. Shreya, anything else?
Yeah, I was actually thinking of Margarita with a Straw, since we were talking about sexuality and disability, and that was the essential sort of space where Skin Stories was also born from, the intersection between sexuality and disability. And Margarita with a Straw is fictionalized in that it's not a true story, quote unquote true story, but it is based on a memoir. It's based on a memoir called One Little Finger by Malini Chand. It's not Malini's life, like it changes many things. And Leila as a character, Kalki Kochlin's character, is not, the things that happen to Leila are not things that are described in the memoir, but there's a baseline difference between a film like Tare Zameen Par and Margarita with a Straw. And you see the source material, right? And and I'm not saying that everything we make has to be based on memoir, etc. But it does need to be based in good research. It does need to be based in rigor. It does need to be based, go beyond, the idea of a person with a disability as your poster girl for inspiration. What I find the most sort of incredibly offensive about Tare Zameen Par is that it's such a, not only is it inaccurate, it's such a cliche inaccuracy. This idea that, he's disabled, so therefore he has to be an extraordinary painter. Why does someone have to be extraordinary to matter? Just because you're uncomfortable with their existence, because they are not like you, or you think they are not like you. Because like Renu said, the question we need to be asking is, in what ways am I disabled? In what ways am I deviating from this quote unquote norm, right? So yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Thanks, Shreya. I'm going to go to Sneha's question. She says, as individuals from marginalized communities, we often are conditioned to certain responses from society at large. How can we overcome this outsider perspective while writing our own stories? I think this is a great question. Would anybody like to go first? Shreya, I think you have maybe, do you have something to say about this?
Yeah, I mean, our writers have talked about this over and over again. Antara, you yourself actually have written about how you joined a WhatsApp group of women amputees, and you didn't, in the beginning, so I'm sorry, I'm talking about your story. Maybe you should talk about this story actually. But, there are so many stories like that where it's inevitable, right? As, even like people from marginalized gender identities will relate to this perhaps, that you're told a certain thing about yourself until it assumes a stature of objective truth. We have an amazing essay by Srinidhi Raghavan who talks about chronic pain, and she says, I struggled to accept that it was real, even though it was a physical reality, because the biomedical establishment kept saying there's nothing wrong, there's nothing wrong, there's nothing wrong. So this idea of what someone is projecting onto you versus what your lived experience is. And I don't have a really simple answer on how, as writers, we can overcome this outsider perspective. One of the ways which writing, opens up for me, when I wrote about living with endometriosis, it was incredibly difficult. Because, first of all, even writing about that brings up so much shame, because you're seen as, like Sarah Ahmed, the academic says, when you expose a problem, you pose a problem, right? So, I really felt very jittery, even though I had been editing skin stories for a while by the time I came to write my own story. But I still had to navigate a lot of shame and internalize stigma and talk to myself about how it was okay for me to talk about living with endometriosis, and I didn't have to shy away from how difficult things were, no matter what the response was. For me, the important thing was to contend with the truth of what I had experienced in my own words. So I don't know if we can fully overcome it in one go or two goes, but I think the more we start to expand the scope of interrogation, conversation, expression, self-expression, in whatever way is available to us, I find that that becomes a way to sort of start to navigate this really massive problem. And I don't think the onus should be on the marginalized community again to overcome. Yeah.
Yeah. But that being said, I do think that while the onus is not on the marginalized community to tell the stories and to come out of it, it's also, like you said, it's incredible. You are dealing with such a feeling of shame when you try to talk about it or when you try to write about it. And so it's like a double-edged sword. Yeah, we shouldn't feel ashamed and we shouldn't feel all of that. But how can we stop doing that if there aren't other stories out there? So, just to bring in that perspective. Is there anything you would like to add to this, Renu and Shruti, or should I move on to the next question?
I think you can move on.
Okay. Renu?
No, I'm okay.
Oh, okay. And I think very related to what Shreya was just speaking about, I'll just quickly read through Sandhya's question, but I think Shreya has sort of already answered it. I also want to talk about invisible disabilities like someone having fibromyalgia or endometriosis or PCOD, for instance. Those are also closely linked to various nuanced factors like hormonal ups and downs that could be related to life factors. Where do they go for their stories? Do they have to be obviously disabled like those with a stammer, say, or those on a wheelchair? It's depressing.
That's a tough one. That's tough because it is a choice you make to reveal. It's not something that's visible. So where does that is where the agency of the person having that particular condition is paramount. And where do you do it? Where do you make that choice? And also there's always the fear that your acha PCOD ye kya hota hai? Is it no, but disabled people, they're the ones who can't see and they can't walk. This is a disease. Why are you calling it a disability? ये तो बीमारी है, इसके लिए दवाई है. There's a medicine. Where is the disease? So you are called upon to explain yourself. And in that explanation, you may want to avoid because it's painful explaining yourself and explaining yourself in the face of skepticism and a certain level of incredulity, because some of these disabilities are not universally recognized as disabling. For example, PCOD is not a disability in India. It may be in some other part of the world, but it's not a disability as a legal entity, while thalassemia and Parkinson is. So it's also the context where you bring this up. So I'm telling you, if someone comes to someone X and says, I have PCOD and I'm disabled, they're going to have a tough time making that case in our context.
Shreya, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, these are tricky terrains. As you mentioned, as we have talked about, the RPD Act also recognized certain disabilities in the latest draft. In fact, I think that there's so much contestation around identity, right? Around what counts or what doesn't count, whether something is diagnosed or not diagnosed. And that I want to be careful and intentional about how I answer this, because I don't want to completely dismiss the idea that something is a disability. We can't generalize to the extent that disability as a category sort of becomes diffuse and completely disappears, right? Because there is an important experience that we can't essentialize in any way. I do think that psychosocial disability, again, we've talked, there's a lot of conversation about how it's invisible. And you can't look at someone and assume anything about them, right? It's very difficult to assume what their particular and specific experience might be. So, no, I mean, I do think like one of the ways in which I have learned from people who worked on this for a really long time, and I continue to learn from the movement, is more and more space is opening up for invisible disabilities and chronic health conditions. More and more place at the table, more and more room for conversation, more and more participation in policy, politics. So yeah, it is very tricky. It's a tricky one, and absolutely there are different sets of challenges to it being visible and then it not being visible as well. And again, I think it brings us back to how difficult it is to say one thing about it, right? It's so many different types. I'm sorry if I'm being vague. I'm just trying not to essentialize.
Yeah.
But absolutely, I absolutely want to affirm that, invisible disabilities absolutely exist and they absolutely need to be made more manifest in how we talk about it.
Yeah. In terms of just one aspect of this question, which is where do they go for their stories, I would just say, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of spaces, even for people with disabilities. The narrative is so ruled by a certain, if you look at disability activists in India, they're largely men. They're largely people who are based out of Delhi or, big cities. They're largely people who have caste and economic privilege. And so even within the space of disability, we have to fight to make our voices heard, and it's not necessarily easier for somebody with a locomotor disability, for example, to if they don't have these privileges to speak it, you have to fight for it. And so I think where do they go for their stories, that part of the question really spoke to me, because I think you have to seek it out and you have to find it. And that's horrible, because you wish that it was more accessible and that, that there was something right there for you. But I just think it's a bit of an uphill climb where we are. But I think, like Renu said earlier also, that right now we are in a time where there is it's a content creators world almost. We can write about our own experiences on our own platforms. We can write a blog, we can write about it on our social media, we can do whatever. And I think that we can actually bring together communities on our own, or, we don't need to ask anybody else to help us up in that sense. So I think there's a big role that plays also. Next question I want to ask to Shruti. It's by Astha. She says, I want to talk about stammering. I'm aware it isn't a disability but a disorder. We've seen in Bollywood how it's used as a comic element to make things more funny. I'm a stammerer myself, and I know that making fun of stammering isn't funny. I haven't come across any literature that talks about speech disorders. Can you throw some light if there's any literature about it? So I think Shruti has 2 books about it, which is a great starting point. But is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Shruti?
Yeah. First of all, I want to talk about her statement that stammering is not a disability but a disorder. So, Asta, I know what you're saying, but the fact is that for many people, stammering is really a disability. They cannot get one word out. For me, I personally do not consider it a disability because it doesn't stop me from doing what I want to. It doesn't stop me from coming on a panel like this and speaking in public, even though I know that I'm stammering, and there are people out there who are right now laughing at me, but I don't care. But the thing is, it isn't right to call it a disorder, because there are a lot of people out there for whom it is not just a disorder. It is a seriously kind of debilitating issue. So I'm sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent out there, but I wanted to, but this is also an example of the kind of spectrum we are all on, right? The kind of variation. So that's an example of that. Okay, now coming to your question, I'm not sure if you're talking about nonfiction or fiction. Nonfiction, I honestly am not very sure, but fiction, yes, I have written one book about a girl who stammers. It is for ages 8 to 12, but a lot of adults have told me that they have enjoyed it and learned a lot from it. The name of the book is Manya Learns to Roar. If you contact me later on, I'll be happy to kind of look up other books and tell you about them, and even maybe chat with you, Asta. That will be nice.
Renuka has a question about schools and colleges. What's your suggestions to educational institutions regarding accessibility for students with disability? I think Renu, you would be best.
Yeah. So you see, the thing is that there are a lot of provisions available for accessibility for students at the I'm presuming the question is with regard to college or university level. And the first thing is that students need to be aware of what is legally available to them. Because, you know, when you negotiate with the organization, you need to have the legal side. That is the only way to push them. Right? Now, many organizations, for example, visually challenged people have an option of a reader allowance, but many times they just can't access that money. They have to fight for it. The office admin staff doesn't know. Hurdles are created. So my suggestion would be 2, 3, 4. 1, be aware, get UGC guidelines, if the college has its own internal guidelines, some document, if there's an equal opportunity in this college, get access to that, get to know what is available for you to formal legal level. Secondly, you need to approach your office. I suggest all correspondence be done in writing, because oral, it disappears. I suggest whenever you make a request, whether it's by email or by letter or whatever, keep a copy, maintain a file. Once you have the written thing, and fourthly, last thing, band together. An individual fighting for something alone is at a weaker position than 4 or 5 people. But do all these things, and if you're in a campus college, there's an equal opportunity cell, there's a special officer on duty. It requires running around. It doesn't happen not naturally. People will not give you what you are entitled to. But once you are aware and you follow it up in the language that they understand, which is not the language of request, it's the language of objective, legally buttressed, I won't call it demand, because then they'll say, "Arey andhe hain aur upar se itna dhos chalate hain." No, but follow the rules, put it in writing, be polite, be civil, don't get emotional. You may succeed. If you don't succeed, you have to find another way.
Thank you. Shruti, Shreya, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, there's nothing else.
I'm speaking primarily from the perspective of an editor. So stories from Skin Stories are constantly coming to me. And the one that came to me for this question was by our writer, Preeti Singh. And she is a wheelchair user, and she talked about her experiences. I think actually her essay is called I Am a Woman with a Disability, and there's something about pity and inspiration. That's actually the title of her piece. You know, she doesn't want to be, oh yeah, I don't want to be seen as either helpless or heroic. That's what she says. And in her story, she talks about how this is also part of the Skin Stories book. It's actually it's the essay that closes the book. She talks about how her campus was such a welcoming place for her, because she didn't feel like she had to, because it was accessible, because they did have ramps and other things, that the design of the campus itself had her in mind, someone like her in mind. It was almost like this welcoming bubble. Like she would get out, and on the metro, people would say all kinds of strange things to her, or, you know, elsewhere. But, you know, her campus was a safe space for her. And that really stayed with me, because, you know, that's what we need to provide to students when they're going, not just students, but anyone who's accessing a campus, anyone who's working on a campus, anyone who's teaching at a campus, but also doing a myriad other kinds of labor on a campus. It should be a safe space, like everywhere should be, but particularly when, you know, you're at a university space. You know, Preeti's experience really was that she didn't have to go out of her way, or no one was looking at her. She could just navigate the physical space, and that immediately opened up a much safer experience for her, and a much more, you know, an example of the kind of design that our cities really need to have. Not just our cities, but everywhere that people live. So that story really stayed with me. That's what I wanted to amplify.
Thank you so much, everybody. Renu, Shruti, Shreya, you have all been amazing. And I, you know, like I said earlier, I think we've just got an amazing, different, you know,
in a webinar.
Perspective. So, sorry. We've got some amazing perspectives in this webinar, and I think it's been an amazing discussion, even for somebody like myself, who I consider myself pretty well versed with this world, but I've learned a lot today. And I hope that, you know, people in the audience who may not be as familiar with the discussions have a lot of food for thought at the end of this. So thank you, all of you, for joining, and thank you, Team Belong, for giving me this opportunity. This is the first time I'm moderating a panel, and it's been great. Thank you.
Thank you, Antara.
Thank you.
Thank you, Antara. Thank you, co-panelists. Very
absolutely.
Enjoyable.
Thanks.
Very enjoyable.
Thanks a lot.
And hope to remain in touch in the future.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.